Thank you for coming, Daniel. You were called the most dangerous man in America by Henry Kissinger. Why was that?
It wasn't because I'd just given the Pentagon Papers to 19 different newspapers. It wasn't because I was on trial facing 115 years in prison for having done that. Those papers incriminated basically the Democratic Party. They ended in 1968 before Nixon came into power, and that was not what Nixon or Kissinger was worried about. In fact, they were glad to have the information out on the Democrats. They were afraid, Kissinger and Nixon, that I had information on what they were doing covertly and the threats they were making against North Vietnam, which had to be secret from the American public. They involved threatening North Vietnam repeatedly with nuclear weapons, secretly from the American public, obviously not secretly from North Vietnam that was getting the threats. Also escalating the war in other ways, hitting the dikes, which could be an international war crime, invading Cambodia, Laos, possibly North Vietnam itself. I did have that information, but I didn't have the documents they feared. I would have had assistants of theirs given me those documents, as I wish they had, and they wish they had. But he was very reasonable to think that they had given me those documents, and he wanted to stop me any way they could. That's what Kissinger said. Ellsberg is the most dangerous man in America. He must be stopped at all costs. And that included criminal acts like sending CIA assets into my former psychoanalyst office in order to get information to blackmail me into silence about what Nixon was doing. And listening to me on warrantless wiretaps, which was then illegal, legal now, though not constitutional, and eventually bringing a dozen CIA assets up to Washington to incapacitate Ellsberg totally on the steps of the Capitol on May 3rd, 1972, when they knew that I was prepared, that I was claiming that they were about to mine Haiphong Harbor, which in fact they did do a few days later. So when those crimes became known, because John Dean, who was plea bargaining, actually told his prosecutor about these crimes from the White House, my charges were dropped, but more importantly, Nixon faced possible prosecution and impeachment proceedings, which led him to resign. And that made the war endable. It ended 9 months later. If I hadn't, in fact, copied documents other than those in the Pentagon Papers, documents belonging to the Nixon administration, Nixon would not have had reason to commit those crimes against me, and the war would have gone on for another 2 years, at least, possibly longer.
So let's fast forward 43 years later. You were the first whistleblower since George Washington's administration to be held up on crimes.
Before his administration, I referred to Nathan Hale, who's a predecessor, I think, of myself, but also of Chelsea Manning and Ed Snowden.
Those were the two next people who were arraigned on whistleblowing.
The three of us were the ones who gave very large leaks, in my case 7,000 pages of top secret documents. Chelsea Manning, hundreds of thousands of cables.
Right.
Ed Snowden, probably millions of pages of NSA documents. We're the ones who gave the largest leaks, but also I think the only ones who consciously chose to risk life in jail.
So you could be called the Muhammad Ali of whistleblowers.
I'm flattered by the comparison. I admire Muhammad very much. He has never gotten as much credit as he deserved for essentially giving up his heavyweight championship title in his bouts at that time in order to protest and refuse to serve in the Vietnam War. As he said, no Vietnam ever called me nigger.
So you're 86 years old.
84.
Sorry. You're 84 years old. You're still out campaigning and talking about how Americans need to wake up and understand and what the administration is doing, what the military-industrial complex, to maintain that reign of champion that you have as the Muhammad Ali of whistleblowing. What do people not know about that you would like to share? What is the Obama administration doing right now in war, the endless wars with either drones or against ISIS, that you think is critical to be exposed?
Look, Obama, like his predecessors, is doing things that the United States should not be doing and that he should not be doing. Things for which he would properly be indicted before the International Criminal Court at The Hague. And that's even more true, I think, of his predecessor, George W. Bush, but it was also true of Clinton and others. It's gone right along. American imperial adventures lead our leaders to order in secret, largely, the kinds of actions that emperors always have to use: torture, assassination, massacres when necessary. You ask about Clinton specifically, and I think it is true to say his crimes are probably, if you're going to compare them, somewhat less than those of George W. Bush, and in some cases not so. In domestic terms, his actions against whistleblowers, against people who have revealed classified information that was wrongfully kept secret from the public, that the public needed to know, he has prosecuted more of those than all previous presidents put together. There's a case where you can't say that the Republicans would have been even worse. But I think his successors will probably be as bad as he, given the precedent that he set on that. However, I believed in support, when I did support him twice, and I don't regret that at all, for the reasons I'm about to give. Not because of his civil liberties case, which I didn't expect him actually to be as bad as he actually has been. I have to say that. But I did believe that he was less certain, less likely to involve us in war in Iran, in attacking Iran, than either George Romney or McCain before him, or for that matter, Hillary Clinton. I thought he was less likely to expand our war in Afghanistan and expand it in Iraq. And even though he did expand in Afghanistan, it was not as much as Hillary actually at the very time, as his Secretary of State recommended. She said, and this is her general policy line, give the generals what they want. And what the generals wanted was at least 90,000 more troops. He shouldn't have sent any more. He did send 40,000. But even that, and then he took them out, which Hillary would definitely not have done, nor would the Republicans. He did get us out of Iraq, thanks in considerable part to the revelations of Chelsea Manning. We could go into that. But again, I don't think his rivals, any of them, would have done that. And I think he's dragging his heels against heavy pressure to get involved in Iran, Syria, again Iraq, and Ukraine. In none of those can we count on him, I think, to keep us out of war. But I think with any of the others, and I'm sorry to say any of the people in prospect, whether it's Hillary or the Republicans, even worse, I believe, or about the same as Hillary, I think that we're likely to get into those wars, which is a terrible future. I'm very hopeful that Obama will succeed in these Iran negotiations, despite all the resistance he's getting from people, and despite the fact that the Republicans have promised to wreck that when they get into office, if they do, 2 years from now, or to wreck it in Congress right now. So I think he wants, by the way, there's two things I could say that I think he's done not only well, but better than I ever expected. The change in relations with Cuba is terrific, and certainly not foreseen by me. And the negotiations with Iran is what he promised when he first got in, but did very little about in the first term. So there we have something where he's not only better than his rivals, but he's really being pretty good. But in question of the drone war, which is assassination, a huge assassination program, where we don't even generally know who we're assassinating. The recent event of killing 2 American hostages, which he did not mean to do, which was inadvertent, merely illustrates that we almost never know who it is we are killing. And in some cases we did know, in the case of Anwar al-Awlaki, who was an American citizen, killing him without indictment, trial, prosecution, trial, testimony, or conviction or sentence. Any of that was simply an act of murder. Unconstitutional, against international law. It really is a kind of an assertion of a power that I think British monarchs have not claimed since the Magna Carta 800 years ago, since John I. George III didn't claim the power to kill British citizens anywhere in the world on his say-so alone. It's a terrible assertion. And what we have then is a monarchical power, which I must say I did foresee. I just thought that it would be less abusively used, aggressively used under Obama than his rivals, and I think that was true, so I don't regret the support. When I say support, I didn't actually vote for Obama in the last election. I live in California. He didn't need my vote. But I did urge people in swing votes to vote for him. I supported him in that sense, and I'm glad that I did. Very frankly, if Jill Stein of the Green Party, whose platform I agreed with in detail and would have been delighted to see enforced, if she had gotten the 5% that she had a right to hope for and would have given her campaign funds later, either nationwide or in the swing states, I believe we'd be at war with Iran right now, and Syria, and Iraq and Afghanistan, because those swing votes would have put Romney into power, and I think that's where we'd be.
So Daniel, let's take it a little simpler and imagine you're telling a 15-year-old. You're implying that Obama is part of an empire that keeps taking...
He was elected to manage an empire, that's
okay.
Right.
So most 15-year-olds understand empire. Most 25-year-olds and 45-year-olds don't understand why a man who was a state senator, became a U.S. senator, then a president, all of a sudden becomes the king of an empire that takes us into endless protracted war. Why are we always going, you've watched this for 40 to 50 years, simple message, why do you think we keep going back into war? Is it a big business?
The first point is to understand that we didn't just become an empire yesterday. We've been an empire for certainly the last 70 years, and it can very well be argued that we had imperial ambitions from the very earliest days with respect to the American continent, for example. In fact, a major reason for the revolution, the War of Independence, was to free us from treaties that the British had made with the Indians that kept us from expanding beyond the Appalachians, and instead freed our successive presidents to take over this huge continent. And that was basically an imperial adventure, just like Russia expanded over the centuries. But in short, a president, whatever his thinking beforehand, and he was probably brought up to believe we're not an empire. We're actually a very altruistic country that only is concerned for the good of everybody. We're a big brother to all, an enemy to none, etc., etc. They don't have much of an understanding of our covert operations over the generations, which have made us what I have called recently a covert empire, meaning a covert operation is one that's subject to not only secrecy, but plausible denial. In other words, you act through proxies, you lay evidence that points to other fingers as the cause of the coup or the assassination or the proxy paramilitary war invading this place or that, whether it's Guatemala or a coup in Chile or a massacre in Indonesia. Very few Americans, young or old, really understand we ran those things. That was us. They don't take credit for it, they don't take blame for it, they don't associate it with us. So we don't have at all the sense that we are like other empires, that we run countries, we determine the governors and the chief of police, and we control the military in countries that aren't ours, not contiguous, although Mexico and Canada are contiguous, and we have a great deal of influence there. But countries that are far away, don't speak our language, different religion, different color, etc. Countries whose language we don't speak and cultures we don't understand, and that we are basically determining their governors and their policies in our interests, largely our corporate interests, because our international interests are very close to being the interests of our multinational corporations, starting with the energy corporations, the oil corporations, but not only those. That is to say then that somebody only gets the funding to run a major campaign, to be, in other words, one of the two parties that are going to win in this country. We have a two-party system that offers really no opportunity for a third party actually to win. We could go into that otherwise. I didn't understand that fully myself until recently, but by Googling third parties in Google, I've learned a lot about why no third party in this country has ever come close to winning, with the exception of the Republican Party in 1856 and 1860, when the Democratic Party split apart on the grounds of race. But other than that, no party since then has come close to winning, and that's not going to change, which is to say that somebody that I backed, like Dennis Kucinich, who ran in the primaries, or whose program I thoroughly agreed with, like Ralph Nader or Jill Stein, had no chance of doing anything but to help elect the party furthest from their beliefs by splitting off the party. I'm not a Democratic Party apologist. In fact, I'm no longer a Democrat. This year I got tired of apologizing for the Democratic Party or being a self-hating Democrat, and I told the registration, take me off the rolls as a Democrat, so I can't vote in the primaries anymore. That's the only difference it'll make. I don't foresee voting for a Republican unless a very different one came along, and there have been very good Republicans, in fact, but they don't get nominated for office, so for presidencies. Anyway, I've said in the last two elections in which I supported Barack Obama that the choice was between two candidates to be monarch. That's the choice our major candidates have. The funding is such that the only person who can get enough money to run a major campaign is someone who in office can be counted on, whatever he says or she says beforehand, whatever, in office can be counted on to serve the interests of the multinational corporations that funded her campaign and pretty much run the country.
So what you've laid out here is a diagram of a man who's now president, who's also won the Nobel Peace Prize, who's dropping bombs in at least 7 countries. Tens of thousands of people have been killed under this president. Is that the multinational corporations have selected presidents or kings or emperors, as you're saying, in order to have destabilized zones around the world in order to have conflict. So can you knit this together for us as to how
my answer to that?
We have a Middle East that's always destabilized, where former CIA, former Defense Secretary Panetta said will be there for at least 30 years. This sounds like a prescription to good business. The question I have for you is, how do these people have any conscience with the amount of deaths that are going on in order to stay in power and make other people money? Because that's what it distills down to.
Men in power, whether they run capitalist empires or socialist empires, if we're to call the USSR socialist ever, their empire in East Europe or wherever, which had a rationale for national security in terms of protecting them against Germany, but was not actually the only way they could have protected themselves against Germany. But it was an imperial way that they chose. And of course we know that the USSR just spoiled the environment and built a doomsday machine just as effectively as the Western capitalists. So we didn't have a real choice there. And China's effect on the environment and their own climate, which is suffocating them in Beijing and elsewhere. Of course, you could say, well, that's because they're capitalists now. But the reason that that's made a difference is it has increased their productivity to the point that they have a lot of cars and a lot of industrial, but their effect on their environment was really no better than ours all this time. So what do we have to choose among? Men in power, I've come to conclude some time before I reached the age of 84, but not when I was 40. Sometime in between there, I came to realize that Vietnam, which killed 3 to 4 million people under people I not only voted for but served, was not an aberration. It was a representative part of American empire. The big difference was that the Vietnamese fought back, so that it was not possible to be covert entirely. We couldn't plausibly deny that we were sending 500,000 troops to Vietnam. So that was pretty overt. And of course, Iraq now was totally the Iraq War was totally overt aggression, a crime against the peace in the terms of the Nuremberg tribunals for which Nazis and Japanese were hanged, as clear-cut aggression and against the UN Charter as anything could be. And Obama came to power because, unlike Hillary, he said that it had been a mistake. It was not only a mistake, it was also a crime, a major crime. And then he, unfortunately, in running against her to show that he wasn't a pacifist, which disqualifies you for managing an empire, had to say he was only against dumb wars. He was for necessary wars and just wars and smart wars like Afghanistan. Now, that was a very amazing thing to say. On the face of the earth, it would be hard to find a region dumber to invade than Afghanistan, with the experience of Alexander, Genghis Khan, the British, the Russians before us, the grave of empires. And it hasn't been our grave yet. It was the grave of the Russian Empire, Soviet Empire, I should say. It hasn't yet been our grave, but I don't have to characterize it further. It was not a smart war. And actually, I'll give him this much credit, I think he really was reluctant to expand that despite his promises to do so. And promises don't amount to much. But he found he had to, because otherwise General Petraeus, of current notoriety, who was then had the top military man in the region, and his protege, General McChrystal, were asking for 90,000 troops and threatening to resign, and Petraeus would have run for president if Obama had not sent at least 40,000 troops. Petraeus, as of now, I guess his presidential ambitions are over. But he could have been our president, and it wouldn't have been to our benefit. Okay, so he gets in, and I have talked now relatively that Obama has been better, I think, than his rivals. But how good is that? How good is he as an empire? Well, I've already said he's acting not just monarchically, but tyrannically in terms of surveillance, domestic surveillance and world surveillance, unconstitutionally and worse in terms of prosecutions than any of his predecessors. There were 3 prosecutions for leaks prior to Obama. Mine was the first in our history. I was joking to you earlier that my one predecessor in terms of being prosecuted for leaks to Americans was Nathan Hale, George Washington's spy, who was hanged by the British before Washington became president during the Revolution, for giving secrets to Americans. We then pass a couple of hundred years until 1971, when I was prosecuted. I'm the second person prosecuted for giving secrets to Americans. 2 after me cases were brought before Obama. Obama has brought 10 cases. The 10th is Petraeus. And Petraeus being Petraeus, he gave some of the worst, most sensitive secrets that have ever been accused of anybody giving, including the identities of covert agents to his mistress, who was also his biographer, and who did with them, we don't know what she may or may not have done in the way of making copies or sharing them with whoever else. For that, just this last week, he got 2 years of probation and a fine. All of the other 9 people have faced major prison sentences for giving much less sensitive material. So that's, again, not a praise of Obama. But here's some other non-praise. His drone war, which, as I say, is a massive assassination program which makes a mockery of the national sovereignty of anyone whose airspace we invade. And that includes not only Iraq and Pakistan now and Afghanistan, but Somalia, Sudan, Yemen, and really anywhere in the world. The president, including this country, has claimed the right to do that. Chelsea Manning revealed a program of handing people over, Iraqis, while we still had large numbers of Iraqi troops, of American troops there, prisoners over to the Iraqis, knowing they would be tortured for political offenses, for example, for revealing corruption among the Iraqi regime which we supported. When Chelsea Manning revealed cables and reports showing that Americans sometimes protested, in fact, hundreds of cases, said, these people are going to be tortured. Should we be turning them over? In every case, they were given the order, clearly an order from above, do not investigate further. Now, those 4 words were an illegal order. Not only is the torture illegal under international law and domestic law and our Constitution, but failing to investigate is illegal under our international commitments, and ordering people not to investigate or turning people over to be tortured by others is as criminal as torturing them ourselves. So in fact, when Obama says, that's not us, that's not American, well, it's not in terms of our ideals, no. But our foreign policy doesn't in the slightest reflect our ideals, though we claim it does. Secretly, it's business as usual. International law is not regarded as any restraint on what we do abroad, or even domestic law doesn't. So Obama, for those handing those people over to torture, to be tortured, is susceptible of being tried at The Hague and would almost certainly be convicted of that war crime. And that's aside from the assassination program, which applies not only to drones, but to a massive use of special forces, special operations forces, SEALs and others of the kind who violated Pakistan's sovereignty going after Osama bin Laden and assassinated him without trial, conviction. Now, does my mention of that mean I sympathize with Obama? That I sympathize, I could say with Obama, but I sympathize with Osama bin Laden? No. When Obama says justice was done, what kind of justice was that exactly? Of course, it was vigilante justice of the Old West, hanging parties, lynch mobs, to go into a country and happen to be a country that we should not be enraging by violating their sovereignty because they are very unstable and have nuclear weapons and might give them to truly give them to nuclear extremists in their own ranks, like their intelligence operation. I would have said that what we do in the way of drone warfare and the Osama bin Laden assassination in Pakistan was an extremely reckless and irresponsible thing to do. Could he have been captured and tried? 100% yes. Contrary to the initial reports that he was ready to fight back with an AK-47, he was unarmed, risen from sleep, and absolutely could have been captured and brought back. It was clearly the orders to the SEAL team, we don't want a trial, we don't want to give him a martyr's, or I should say an indictee's platform to talk about the crimes of America, which he would have done. And perhaps he might even have talked about the money we used to funnel indirectly to him indirectly through CIA and through the Pakistanis when he was fighting Russians on our behalf. So he might have talked about that. That wouldn't have been good publicity. Killing. And that's what we did do. And I trust I will not be seen as being sentimental about Osama bin Laden when I say that the precedent of killing an enemy of the United States who, far from a battlefield, unarmed, who could have been captured and tried, and even that would have strained our relations with Pakistan. So I'm saying the whole operation was very questionable, given that the effect on al-Qaeda was probably zero to dispose of Osama bin Laden at that point. George W. Bush said, that's not my priority, it won't make any difference. I rarely cite George W. Bush as an authority that I agree with him on anything, but actually that was pretty fair. It didn't matter to us, really, our national security, that the Pakistanis were protecting Osama bin Laden. He was out of the picture by that time. It was very good for Obama, especially with his name, by the way, to kill somebody named Osama. And it was very good for him to be able to say, I'm as tough as anybody, I'm as bloodthirsty as anybody. That's the way you get reelected, and you don't otherwise. And Hillary will talk that way and will act that way, although she is of a different gender.
We've talked about the politics and the history. We've even talked about how it makes people rich. Let's put it into a human.
Including Russians, by the way. A lot of Russians are getting very, very rich now. And a lot of Chinese.
War makes a lot of money, is what I'm hearing.
On arms, on dope, on every kind of thing.
It also creates a lot of tragedy, a lot of deaths, injuries, refugees.
I'm sorry. I did start to say earlier, and I never finished the sentence. I started to sit and saying men in power. Here's what I learned sometime between 40 and 80 in my years. Men or women in power will kill any number of people, and when I say any number of people, to stay in power, to win an election, to avoid losing office, to avoid even losing legislative power. And when I say any number of people, no limit, I mean they will risk nuclear war. Now, I'm not saying they want nuclear war. They don't. Nobody, virtually nobody wants nuclear war. An awful lot of people in leadership positions or people who serve leaders will advise or direct risking nuclear war. That's outrageous, unconscionable, illegal by any standards of international law, but that's what happens. It's just true of every nuclear state, and there are 9 of them.
We're running out of time here, but could you give us some guesstimate or estimate that you know of how many people have died in the wars that America have created in possibly your lifetime? You said it's been about 70 years as an empire.
A friend of mine, Fred Brantman, who unfortunately just died of Lou Gehrig's disease, exposed the killing we were doing in Laos. He wrote a terrific book called Voices from the Plain of Jars in Laos. He was a lifetime activist. But during the Indochina peace campaign that he was part of during the war, he put out a poster that was very shocking and was true, based on U.S. statistics. 6 million. It was the number of people we had killed, injured, or made refugee, which itself involved millions of people in Cambodia and Vietnam. So they weren't all killed, but they were all victims of our war, which was an unjustified war. It was unjustified homicide, meaning that everyone who died on both sides was guilty of unjustified homicide at the hands of the U.S. government. There would have been no war there. What would have happened probably ultimately is the running of Vietnam by a Stalinist regime, a tyrannical, dictatorial regime, very nationalist, more or less, possibly more Stalinist than Tito's Yugoslavia or Mao's. It wouldn't have been a wonderful time for them. There would not, however, have been a war, because those people had the prestige and the authority and the leadership of having ousted the foreigners, the French, and later conducting a war against American invaders against them. So they would have prevailed, essentially. We're still fighting people who have very little to recommend them. The Taliban, ISIL, right now, they're among the worst, although both of them reflect U.S. support in the past, because we regarded their alternatives as being even worse. I could go through a great list on that. But the point is, here, ISIL's power derives almost entirely, except for its immediate adherents, a very tiny minority, from the fact that they are presenting themselves as the most effective resistors to American, we are foreigners there, hard as it is for us to conceive of ourselves as foreigners anywhere, but they are going against foreign occupation. And they're the best game in town when it comes to that, in Iraq right now or Syria. And that is what attracts people to them. That means that when they are bombed by us, they get more recruits than we kill. And I'm even including the civilians that we kill. We attract recruits to them which derive almost entirely from our aggression against them. Don't call it aggression, our military operations against them. When people say, what do you do about ISIL? I would say, don't strengthen them. And that means don't send American bombers against them. Why, after all, does ISIL has ISIL been cutting off heads on television. What's that about? Makes them look vicious and brutal and worthy opponents for our military operations. Saudi Arabia, our ally, and now bombing for us and with us in Yemen illegally, Saudi Arabia beheads more people than ISIL ever has. But they don't do it on television. Why is that? Because doing it on television raises the likelihood that we will bomb ISIL, which Saudi Arabia doesn't want, doesn't need. ISIL does need it, and it gets it. And we should stop doing that. We should stop recruiting for them. The same is true in places like Syria and others, where as in Vietnam, American military imperial operations are counterproductive from the point of view of the empire, although they do make profits for the people who sell the weapons. You know, you asked about I've talked about multinational corporations. In 1950, when I was still in college, graduated in 1952, there was one multinational corporation in the world, in America, one corporation that made a large part of its profits and its investment abroad. And that was what is now Exxon, Standard Oil, particularly. As the years went by, they were joined by other oil companies. And for a long time, our foreign policy was, to a good first approximation, oil policy, not just in the Middle East, but in the world. That's no longer so true. The financial, in the last 20 years, Wall Street has come to be of greater dominance, and Wall Street was the major funder in the campaigns of both Obama and Hillary, which was to say there wasn't reason to expect much difference between them. I happen to think, having seen Hillary and Bill, who we look back with reason nostalgically now, but that I thought Obama would be better. And as the years went by in his first term, I thought, well, I've been wrong about that. It was about the same. On Cuba and Iran, I would now say, he has turned out to be better than I expect from her. But anyway, Wall Street was backing both of them, hedges its bets. And of course, the Republicans as well. The Koch brothers, of course, we're back to energy, or Cheney with Halliburton, oil industry. So then there's insurance, and there's pharmaceuticals, and there's the chemical industry in general. So it isn't just either energy or the military-industrial complex, but they're all in there. When you talk about an oligarchy or plutocracy, we have our oligarchs. In Russia, they call them oligarchs. Here, we haven't gotten into that mode somehow. I'm not quite sure why we don't talk about our oligarchs. Are the Koch brothers oligarchs? When every Republican candidate this week is going on bended knee to be vetted by the Koch brothers for the nomination, I think it's fair to call them oligarchs. I wonder whether they would reject that name or not. But they're not the only ones. Oligarchy, of course, is not a matter of one or two or three people. It's a ruling elite, and it is not only capitalism that has ruling elites. The history of empire is the history of civilization. And by civilization, I'm distinguishing it from the pre-civilized period, going back to the pre-agriculture period. But as long as we've had cities and metal weapons and horses, the tanks of their era, the airplanes of their era, the drones of their era, in effect, the cutting edge of technology, we've had empire. And unfortunately, we now have empire in the nuclear era, and I don't think the human species can coexist with imperial wars in the nuclear era very long. I don't think our chance of outliving the current trends is great. It's just not zero. I haven't even talked, of course, about the climate problem, and you've heard me talk earlier about the nuclear war problem, which remains a very, very serious problem right now, much more than people realize. Those two issues threaten the existence of humanity. There's a lot of other issues. Inequality, which is tied in with these very much, which has virtually always been with us since civilization. Also, that means 5,000 or 6,000 years, certainly 4,000 years. We've had the inequality. It has been compatible with survival, even great population increase. That's not true anymore. The inequalities that lead to oligarchical control of resources and military operations, now armed with nuclear weapons, and using fossil fuel in the way that we all are, basically, in the advanced countries, the developed countries, and the underdeveloped are going in that direction. That's not compatible with 10 billion people, which we're supposedly moving toward. It's not compatible with 7 billion. I don't believe with climate alone we're going to see a population of 7 billion 50 and 100 years from now, maybe 40 years from now. With a nuclear war, we'd go down to 100 million? I mean a nuclear war between Russia and the US, which is being threatened right now over the conflict in Ukraine. The idea of armed conflict between Russians and NATO, including America, would probably lead to the use of nuclear weapons and probably, not certainly, to an all-out use of our alert weapons on the Russian and US side. The effect of that would be a nuclear winter. The smoke from the burning cities, the smoke, not the radiation or the blast or the immediate heat, the smoke from those cities would be blasted up into the stratosphere where they would surround the globe and cut out sunlight. Not all, but most sunlight for over a decade. Enough to kill all the harvests in the world, not just, and to, it might or might not be serious enough to freeze the rivers and the lakes, but it wouldn't need to do that. It just needs to kill the harvests, leading to a nuclear famine and the death of not all, but nearly all people in the world. More than 6 billion of them, many more, would die from starvation within a year or two. The last to go would be food exporting countries like ours that have large stockpiles of food. The first to go would be the 2 or 3 billion people who live on marginal nourishment right now. They would die from a nuclear war between India and Pakistan, using just 100 Hiroshima-sized weapons. Those are the weapons that are the triggers for our 5,000 American thermonuclear weapons, each of which has a Hiroshima, actually a Nagasaki type bomb, as its trigger or detonator. Using only those detonators, which is all that Pakistan and India have, their war would reduce sunlight around the world by about 7%, shorten growing seasons, shorten harvests, kill about 2 billion people. Or as Edward Teller used to say, the father of the H-bomb, only 1/3 of the world's population. His attitude was that of the glass 2/3 full. He was kind of an optimist. Well, that's right, 1/3. Our weapons would kill nearly everybody. India and Pakistan have what I call, well, I won't go into it, but we have a doomsday machine for sure in the US and Russia. It is unconscionable, outrageous. It should not have existed ever. It has existed for over 50 years on both sides, especially the US a little first, and has existed for at least 40 years. 50 years on the Russian side, more like 60 years on our side. A doomsday machine which, if used as planned, burning the cities of the other superpower, would cause smoke that would starve nearly everyone on Earth. There is no excuse for this. It is not the focus of any movement today, although the people we're talking to here have spent most of their lives protesting against it, but without effect. The doomsday machines persist, and both the US and Russia plan to modernize their forces. Obama plans to spend like $1 trillion over the next decade in modernizing our submarines, our missiles, our bombers. None of that money should be spent. If we could afford it, all of that and more should be spent on many other things, from world hunger and education and infrastructure, and in many ways reducing the inequalities and the inequities. Almost any use is better, because that spending of the money should not happen at all. We should be willing to spend money to keep that modernization from happening. And yet both sides are doing it. Russia also. They don't have $1 trillion to spend. They plan about 1/3 of $1 trillion over the next decade. In short, we're ruled by madmen as before. And perhaps soon, with luck, it'll be a mad woman in this country. Or an even worse, madman. And when I use that, I don't mean that they're clinically mad in some way that could put them individually into a clinic. They are acting like people of power have always acted, and with the support of most of the population. But most humans are acting madly. They are psychotically divorced from the realities of the world in which we live. And if that goes on, it won't be for much longer. However, the chance of changing that is, I believe, within our human individual capabilities. There's no question individuals can change. You mentioned, I think, Muhammad Ali, that he didn't grow up as a black Muslim. Bruce Jenner, you mentioned, actually, who is famous now for having decided to live openly as a woman, having felt apparently for some time feminine qualities, which would not have made him a nominee for president. But I think we can change. Humans can change. I, of course, changed my life very significantly. The question is, can we actually change as a society? No one can say it's impossible. The odds are against it. It's a low chance that the nations of the world, organized as they are, with the inequalities they have, and the delusions they have been taught to believe, can deal with climate or nuclear weapons. The odds are against it, but they're not zero. Nobody can say it's impossible. No one foresaw that the Cold War would end as it did, or that the Berlin Wall would come down. No one foresaw that I know of. It happened nonviolently. No one foresaw majority rule in South Africa. That had coming about nonviolently. That has not, and by election, that has not brought paradise on earth in any way to South Africa. But it's a change that was for the better and was not foreseen. So I think we have to recognize that things that look impossible or that we don't even imagine and calculate whether they're possible or not can happen, and that can include good things as well as bad. And that's what we have to count on, that it is something, in fact, worth our lives to work toward.
Well, Daniel, you've proven many things in the last hour here. One of the main things that you've proven is the vitality and the energy and the passion and the intellect that you bring to all of these different topics. You may be proving to people that standing up, speaking truth to power, being a whistleblower, not being afraid of the powers that be, will allow you to live a long life, a vital life. Thank you for all of the service that you've done for us. Thank you.
Thank you.